Welcome back to the Peak Performance Podcast. Today is a solo episode with myself and the lovely Sean. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. How have you been? It's been a while.
I know. I was a bit rude. I was just saying it feels like forever since I've been in here. You've really flown solo in the past 3 episodes.
I just didn't want you to get in the way of some of the bromances that I
that's
do have
true.
with a few of the people, particularly in this facility. But it's lovely to be back in the building with you.
Thank you for inviting me back in.
No, that's okay. And just to have probably our third date night this year, maybe.
I don't know. That's probably pushing it. This might be number 1, to be honest with you. We're in March and it's number 1, but that's okay. So today we're going to be diving into your experience in working in female high performance sport. So for those of you who don't know, Sean's first 3 major contracts working in high performance sport were, predominantly with females. And even before that, which we will talk about, a lot of those early days too were working with females in a range of different sports. So obviously I've had a bit of a backseat experience to that, as well as being the wife of a S&C coach, and we joke about that I might write a book one day called The Wife of an S&C Coach, because I tell you there's some stories. I'm sure in every industry there is, but I've ridden that wave. I know Sean talks about the journey, and if you listen to Blake Ashby's episode a few episodes back, it is a journey to get to that high performance sport. But I have ridden that wave as well, so we'll save that for another episode. But yeah, if you'd like to, I guess, share with us your journey to those first sort of 3 pro contracts and what they were.
Yeah, well, the first 3 you would say would be lacrosse, AFLW, and then the WNBL, or I guess the highest level in which those females are able to apply their trade. There's a little bit of a crossover in terms of my introduction to lacrosse initially, and then that becoming probably more of a significant part of my workload. So you could almost argue that the AFLW was really the most substantial professional contract in those initial years. But I think it probably even stems a little bit further before that. Obviously, we've done a lot of work in the private space, and one of the funnest roles that I ever had was at the Darren Lehman Academy, of which we did 6 months here throughout the year, and we had athletes coming over, and for the most part, I'd say 95% of those athletes were male, but we did have a couple of superstar women that would come down, and often per cohort it'd be one, woman within that. So, Catherine Bryce is one that springs to mind, who's gone on to represent her country from a cricketing perspective. But the other aspect of that role that opened up opportunities for both of us was that there would be 6 months of the year where we'd go and do some trips around the world and facilitate programs, either with a squad of athletes from Australia, or we would go and work with athletes within their country themselves. We were fortunate enough to head to India, which was still one of my favourite, work and sporting memories. And we were tasked with working with a rural academy in Bangalore that had both a male and female stream. And that was probably in a team setting the first real exposure to that, I'd imagine. So we sort of rolled in, and often what would happen is they'd sort of split into multiple groups. As you remember, there'd be sort of skills and, tactical, and then the other groups, so either male or female, would be doing some S&C and mobility work with us, and then we'd sort of swap over after lunch. And I just remember how great, it might have been a cultural thing, but how attentive and how grateful and how switched on those girls were. And even to this day, we're talking almost 9 or 10 years later, we still keep in contact with some of those girls on social media. So that was probably a little spark for me. And I don't know. I want you to reflect on. I know we're sort of talking about my experiences too, but do you remember much about that sort of time and the way that maybe the girls interacted or adapted to our program compared to some of the guys in that instance, to be completely transparent?
Yeah, well, I obviously am not an S&C coach, and I was sort of invited or joined that trip. Yes, I sort of was being used as a mobility and yoga instructor over there as well. Obviously in India there is a really strong cultural appreciation and understanding of yoga in their lives. So I think the coaches from the Darren Lehman Cricket Academy identified that was going to be a good link going over there culturally. But they also, kind of said come along because there was no other females in the Australian staffing cohort that were coming over. And they thought that would be a really good asset as well to sort of broach any cultural issues or understandings that might go on there. So that was really cool to have the opportunity to come over and do that. And as you're saying, I don't think it is isolated because, as we'll talk about in a second, all of the other sporting groups that we have worked with, I think that has been a really common thread is that the gratitude or willingness to learn and absorb information. And this is just a generalisation here. I'm not speaking on any evidence that I've necessarily read, but anecdotally, we probably feel that maybe that's because they haven't had as much exposure to high performance knowledge or diverse coaches or information. So they're just really willing to soak up and learn anything they can, as opposed to maybe the boys or male groups who you might be the literal 100th S&C coach that they've had along their journey. I'd agree that there definitely was that appreciation of us being there and willingness to learn.
And that experience was probably exacerbated by the fact that, particularly in that country at that time, that opportunity for women as a whole was growing, as you've sort of touched on, and even some of the resources you could see were pretty evident. There was, girls that were getting dropped off to training by their families or, trying to make their way there however they can. And some of the guys were being dropped off by their personal chauffeurs and then breaking with their chefs at lunchtime.
And these were kids as well. These are teenagers.
So quite a disparity in the resources available to them as well. So that, was that first little spark. I guess if we fast forward down the line a little bit, I went to the Power, which was back into a male environment predominantly. And then, we launched Peak 1.0 at the start of 2019. And there was a couple of sisters who rolled through the door one day, the Parker sisters. So I'll give a shout out to BT and Liv, who really, if I'm transparent, they did, almost change our lives essentially. They came in as, at that point in time, again, and for a long period of time, even after that, Lacrosse Australia was very lowly funded. A lot of them would fund their own training or whatever it might be. And at that point in time, I know that they were doing some form of like group circuity style training, an F45-ish sort of setup. And then they were provided a PDF program by the organisation that they would just lump on top of whatever they're doing with their club training. And they said, hey, we've heard some things about you guys and we'd love a little bit more structure around what we're doing. Can you help us out? And that was my first introduction into working with lacrosse and understanding what it was. I know I played a little bit in group dynamics with Wendy Piltz back at UniSA. I'm sure there's many cohorts of students who would understand who Wendy is and Jen Williams as well. But I had to quickly, get into doing some research and understanding what that was all about. A few months later, I guess the head coach had seen some of the progress that those girls had made and maybe seen some stuff on social media because that was part of our growth at that point in time, and ended up getting a call and having a coffee with Trish Adams, who, again, I'm super grateful for. She took a risk and gave us an opportunity to open those services to the rest of the women's lacrosse team. Pretty quickly after that, COVID hit and we did a bunch of stuff at home and online. But we built connections, super quickly. And again, they just welcomed us with open arms. I was fortunate to, go and do some national-based camps after that. And we built up and ended up going to the World Championships from a traditional 10v10 perspective, and then on to the World Games and won a bronze medal from a 6v6 perspective. And it was sort of at that time that the men's years perked up and I ended up taking on sort of the whole program. So, yeah, that was amazing. And then sort of somewhere in between or around that time, we got contacted by a few of the Crows AFLW girls because of a lot of the restrictions and the resources and the logistical constraints that those girls had to navigate in the early stages of the AFLW. I know that they weren't allowed to use the gym at the Crows at the same time or something along those lines. I'm probably misquoting that a little bit. And they were looking for a private facility that was geographically close to facilitate their programming. So they came down. So, we had Chelsea Randall, we had Erin Phillips, we had MJ and Renee and Juicy and, a crew that really became family quickly to us. And one thing led to another. They had some staff changeover. And I remember Chelsea saying to me one day, hey, would you be open to having a chat to our head coach, Clarko? I said, yeah, for sure. So sat down, had a coffee in that front office area at Peak 1.0. There's lots of great memories there. And I ended up being appointed as one of the first only female-only S&C coaches. So prior to that point in time, it had been essentially the men's staff who would extend their days out. They sort of get there at 6 or 7 in the morning and work with the men through till 3 o'clock. And then all of a sudden pick up the women's program as well. So, kudos to the staff at that time who were working super hard, but they were doing a huge volume of work. The Crows had won the premiership the year before. However, I think it was something along the lines of 6 or 7 ACL injuries in that single year. So they identified that it was time to really sort of hone in. And that was, something that I loved dearly. That was, essentially like a family itself as well. And I remember we just had Matilda at the time, and they were gracious enough that first round was going to be on your first birthday since giving birth to Matilda, and we wanted to be all together. We were round 1 in Brisbane, and the club, beautifully flew you and Matilda and myself over, and we made a weekend of it. Do you have any memories of that weekend and the way that maybe the girls made you feel in that environment?
Yeah, I was maybe going to touch on this later, but we can definitely go there now. And I think just before we do that, we've also missed a really key person as well. We were involved in some NRLW
of course.
sport as well.
How could I forget that?
One of our OG members as well, Kelly Rook, introduced us to that sport and brought us into that family. Again, a sport that in South Australia in itself, men's and women, really doesn't have a big following or a big support or resource base. And we were specifically working with the females and went away on 2 state trips as a whole family. You, me and Matilda we all had roles. I was head of wellbeing and, assisted you in some of that recovery and mobility. You obviously were overseeing the S&C work and on-field, pre-game sort of warm-ups and stuff for them. And then Matilda was dubbed the happiness coach. So she was actually given a role as well. Coming back to that, I guess something that has really, for me as a family member, having a backseat to all of these contracts is every female team that you've been involved with has really involved us as a family. And that hasn't gone unnoticed. And also I've seen for a lot of the female athletes, you mentioned Erin Phillips there. I know she had a young family in those days at the Crows as well, and her family became a part of Peak. And I think whether or not there was intention behind that from an organisation perspective to make things really accessible for women and their families, or whether it was just a byproduct of women being in head coaching roles and being in support staff roles that naturally that sort of lent itself to that welcoming environment. I can't thank those organisations and people enough for, we had a young family, a young business. You were trying to create a career, and it made some of those, long days or split days. You'd be at training really early or really late, or you were travelling. Every role up until now with Adelaide United, you've had a travelling role. So there's been a lot of travel, and for me being at home with the kids and juggling the business, feeling like we could lean on that support system was amazing.
Thanks for being flexible, darling. Sorry for being so stressful.
No. I just think it's an interesting observation that, and maybe something that I took for granted. Only now do we have a bit of perspective that you are working in your first predominantly male-dominated environment in high-performance sport, and there has been a little bit of a shift in experience there. That's maybe something I took for granted. And thank you to those women and sporting organisations that helped us in those early days to make it an environment. And it's interesting, I was having a chat to Charlie Grant, who was down here visiting back from the UK the other week, about how she has found that in sport and what her perspective is. And I think we are constantly, or not we, the sport and the industry is constantly evolving. And whilst, yes, in any workplace or high performance environment, there are absolutely situations where, you got to lock in and it's not appropriate to have kids in meetings or team trainings or times like that. But I think to create an environment where an athlete, a mum, a dad, whoever it is, can go and ask for support or ask, say, we've got no help with the kids, is there someone around that can assist? Can I bring them to this training? To feel like those doors are open, I think is maybe something that hasn't been there before, and is really important to make it inclusive for families and to be involved in high performance sport. I don't know, do you have a perspective as a dad in those roles and experiencing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely felt the pressure of balance, particularly in more recent times. And what I've almost felt sometimes is, and this may or may not be wrong, may or may not be correct, sorry. I've just got a specific experience, and I want to be clear that this is by nobody who has employed me. However, there was a time in which with one of the roles that I have, we were utilising an external facility. We were juggling. I can't remember exactly what the context of the day was. And we had to go do recovery at a space, and I brought the two kids along. And it's a very mindful, as you said, I understand 100%, and the feelings of those involved are valid in regards to it's a very fine line between having kids there that can be disruptive or animals or whatever it might be, and keeping a professional
I hope you're not making a correlation between our children and animals.
Harrison is a bit of a wild animal. Matilda's good, but if we had two Matildas, we'd be fine. No, he's going to have a lot of trauma when he's older because I've sprayed him a few times on a lot of our social media. Anyway, I was very diligent in ensuring that our children, during this recovery session, were sitting in the corner, like, reading books. We try to keep them away from screens, but on screens.
And you gained approval.
And I gained pre-approval for that to occur from a female who is high up in an organisation. Talked to a number of staff members at that given facility on that day, of which all of the communication was super positive, and then received an email maybe 24 or 48 hours later saying that it was unprofessional, that I brought children into that facility and that I shouldn't be doing it, and so on and so forth. So I was a bit taken aback by that, to be honest with you, because I was so self-conscious about it, number one, that I felt that they were actually very well behaved, and I'd put my hand up and say if they were running around or being a distraction or even being an health and safety hazard, because we deal with that every day in this facility. And even for me, like, I want our kids to be seen to be looking up to all athletes, but particularly in this example, strong female athletes. So I was pretty taken aback by that. And then in that same operation, I've seen mums bring in children on multiple occasions. And now I can't say whether they've been communicated to or not, but it does make me feel is there a double standard in that space as to I am a male and I should just be out working and the female should be home. So it's probably a bit of a different way to look at it, but that was a bit of an eye-opener for me. But I can only reiterate your messaging in terms of with particularly all of the female organisations that I've been a part of have been nothing but accepting, and I still have a really fond memory of actually, I think it was maybe even on the way to a training session or a game in Brisbane with the AFLW, and they all stopped and sang you happy birthday on the bus, which was like, there's this new S&C coach who's brought his wife and little kid along. They had no obligation to do that. So, that's something that I always cherish a lot for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was really interesting for me as a mum who, maybe I move through the world a little bit differently than you do. Mums are physically, psychologically forced to deal with having a kid and, being quite attached whilst you're pregnant, and then those first couple of years after, to having a kid with you all the time and how that impacts you from a work perspective. And athletes, have to stop their career and hit pause and then, try and come back from that. So it was interesting for me to see you as a dad to have that experience and discuss that I wish that we had some of those athletes in the room now. And again, I don't want to talk on their behalf, but maybe when this episode goes live, if some of them could give a bit of feedback. And what's been really heartwarming is I think a lot of them, the feedback has been like, actually, I think specifically to a lot of the Lightning girls that, maybe you were going through a bit of a heavy period of lots of losing and team morale was down. And sometimes having kids or families in that environment actually psychologically does provide a bit of a shift in energy and a bit of a change. And that a lot of the athletes commented that they really enjoyed having the kids around. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I can only echo that. And actually, one more thing that I think ties in nicely, slightly away from the sporting realm, and I don't want to get too far into the male-female thing, but what is funny, and we've had a laugh at it a few times, you usually will criticise me for it, but I'm just a recipient, is that how often is it that I'm at the shops by myself, for example, or you might have deviated away and I've got the kids there by myself and I get congratulated for having the children.
Well done for going to the shops with both of your children. You are a saint.
It's unbelievable. I've been congratulated so many times.
Like, that's actually not a joke. I think it's probably happened about 5 times before.
What a great dad. I was like, well, it's sort of an obligation, to be honest with you. So anyway, I know we've laughed about it and I try to stay very neutral, but anyway. So.
Right. Yeah, so we'll recap. We've had that Darren Lehman Cricket Academy introduction in India to working with female cricketers. There was the NRLW experience there, lacrosse, AFLW. Then you transitioned over into being the head of S&C at the Lightning.
Yeah, so to be honest with you, I was really upset. I did lose my contract during COVID for the Crows AFLW. I remember, as you said, I did travel. We were playing the Kangaroos in Launceston, so we've jumped on a plane to Tasmania. And there was this family on there who all were wearing masks. We started hearing rumblings of COVID happening in China, and we're like, these guys are crazy. Like, that thing is not coming over here. And then the next week we played in front of no crowd against GWS. I was like, well, this is a bit more serious now. And then the next week, Phil Harper came out and said, season's done. Got pulled into the office a few months later, and they said, look, we've had losses financially. There is restrictions in terms of the number of people who can be in the facility, blah, 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 blah. So your contract's done. So that was pretty heartbreaking because we loved that. However, you've got to move on and sort of keep pushing. At that point in time, we just sort of dove straight back into the business. I was still doing lacrosse in different capacities. And then one day, this very athletic woman walks into the facility and goes, oh, look, I'm not super happy with the S&C setup that we have at my club at the moment. I'm a basketballer. I'm really keen to do some extra stuff. And I was like, I recognise this woman, but I can't think of who she is. Anyway, show her around. Didn't ask for a single thing for free, which, again, speaks volumes of this woman because we have so many spuds. We've got NBL 1 players who are like, I'll do a post for you. Can I have a free membership? Well, I guess stuff, mate. Anyway, signs up, full price membership, Steph Talbot. Oh, my God. Oh, captain of the Lightning, Opals, Olympian,
Steph.
WNBA player. I'm like, oh my God. Anyway, again, one of the most humble human beings you've ever met in your entire life, just a superstar. So we started working together. It was almost not too dissimilar to the lacrosse setup. And we started doing, actually probably all 3 setups now that I think about it. I've never probably put that together, but we started working with her. That then led to an introduction to a new coach coming in, Nat, who we love dearly. Went through an interview process for their setup and took on the Lightning. And again, just a great experience. I really thoroughly enjoyed that. I felt like that was sort of another step up. It wasn't quite as well resourced as the Crows, so I had more responsibility, to be honest with you. At the Crows, I was really refined in the gym, whereas at the Lightning, I was the team manager, the bus driver, the S&C, the strapper, anything you could think of, we would dive in. And big thank you to Brando as well. But as you said, I was there probably 4 or 5 times per week. I travelled with him interstate. It was a challenging time because we didn't have a great deal of success, and unfortunately that's been a consistent thing with the Lightning over the last couple of years. However, just the work and the relationships that we built over that 3.5-year period, it's something that I'll remember for the rest of my life, and still grateful to have people in our lives now. When I bump into Steph and her beautiful partner Hef, who's a member here, Bash and Loz, who are part of the facility too. A number of the girls who have come back and played NBL 1, that's something that I will always cherish for sure.
So now that we've obviously heard a bit of that journey and some of our anecdotal experiences in working in those spaces, I'd like to dial in a little bit more specifically for those coaches or athletes listening, for yourself as an S&C coach working in those female spaces. Were there any considerations? Did you do anything differently in terms of your role? Can you talk to us on the more S&C side of things?
Yeah, I'll be honest in saying that the more experience I got in this space, the more I realised how little we know as an entire industry. I know we've talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect before from an individual's perspective, but what I realised, and probably the real turning point for me, I was probably more militant prior to 2023. In 2023, I was fortunate enough to be selected to go and present at the UK SCA, so the national sort of strength and conditioning body for the UK, and I listened to this fantastic presenter, a professor, and I apologise, I cannot remember her name, but she did this magnificent speech on training females. And what she alluded to essentially is that although it's wonderful that we all have hypotheses and we're trying to work on these, we are at such infancy in a really solid research evidence, point of the timeline of female training, that we shouldn't be making any absolute concise conclusions around anything to do with training males different to females. So I would say, for example, like when I was at the Crows, anecdotally, we had some girls who it wouldn't matter what time of the month or year it was, they could train as hard as you want and work. Anne Hatchard, a great example of just an absolute machine. We had others on the other end of the spectrum who, anecdotally, in that sort of 5 to 7 days leading up to day one of menstruation, would have awareness in their soft tissues, tight hamstrings or calves. So we'd have to modify their program. We played around with a few different models, and again, each one of them was slightly different. Some of them would work to the book where if you deloaded by 30%, they'd cope with it and then you ramp them back up appropriately. Others couldn't even cope with that. So there was a circumstance of one in particular of pretty much she just swam for a week and then played the game, which goes against all rules of periodization and strength and conditioning because that's a huge peak and a huge trough. However, it worked in her circumstance. So anecdotally, that made sense to me. So probably on a broader spectrum, I would, in all the other sports I've worked with, say, we'd start to track the cycle of an athlete if they did have one. Some didn't, have periods in which they bleed. And we'd give them the option, hey, 5 to 7 days leading in, would you like us to reduce your volume down? Would that make you feel better, worse, whatever it might be? And then progressively from day 1 up until day 14, start to build them up again. The other incredible part of this presentation that I saw in the UK as well, and something that I didn't really have a concept of, is prior to that, my understanding of menstruation is that if you were bleeding, you got a normal period, and if you weren't bleeding, you don't have a normal period, whereas that couldn't be further from the truth. And she showed 4 different scenarios in which somebody bleeds regularly, on their normal cycle for 7 days out of the month or whatever it might be. However, hormonally, there's something really badly, or say really drastically different to what we would anticipate as normal. So the only real true way to understand whether the interplay of your estrogen and progesterone is by doing like blood sampling on a daily basis, which is super invasive. So for me, it made me realize, oh my God, like we know such little about this. Now, there are huge amounts of resources being poured into that right now. However, I was using the example before we started recording that it's not too dissimilar to when we look at, the medical industry and when we've been, in some circumstances, encouraged to take some sort of vaccine, for example, at which point it's so early in its infancy that people are like rushing to get this research done so that we have an understanding of what it is. But the time is now. We're making decisions in the trenches now. So people at some points in time took a vaccine because they felt like it was going to be beneficial, and some people were saying it was good for you, some people weren't sure, whatever it might be. Now, 18 months down the track, we've got probably a clearer idea of the implications of either the good or the bad of that. I sort of relate that to now is that like there's professional female athletes that are working full time and also staff that are working full time in female sports, and they're doing their best to implement what they think has been sort of suggested. I'm going to deload them 5 to 7 days leading into day one or whatever it is, and their Q angles are this and that. And however, we just won't know until 5 or 10 years down the track, and there's really solid evidence, I think, to be honest.
I think that's a really fair comment, and I'll put my hand up and say, as a female, up until maybe the last, 12 to 18 months, maybe since going through having kids, I didn't even really have a full awareness of the different phases of my cycle and what that means and how my cycle was different to my friends. And so absolutely there is such a difference from person to person. And if, we did a really interesting episode with one of our in-house coaches, Velvet, who has done a PhD in this space as well. So if you're interested in hearing about that, and a lived experience of an athlete, Bridget Belton, in going through sport, high-performing sport, and experiencing issues with her cycle. So that's absolutely very valid. What I want to touch on maybe then is if you don't have the information or the research to actually implement things, and what I'm hearing is, as an S&C coach, it is quite on a case-by-case example, versus just completely ignoring that, because we know that if we're talking about female sport, that probably is predominantly one of the biggest areas of conversation, and that can affect performance. You maybe are someone who's moving through life now, who has a wife, who has kids. You've witnessed me give birth, so your personal experience and understanding in that space might be a little bit more accelerated than the lay person, or the lay male, who is at university studying exercise science. How did you feel having those conversations with your female athletes, and what advice do you have to more predominantly male coaches in having those conversations?
Yeah, I think it's about being upfront from the very beginning and being as objective and as professional as you can in those scenarios. I think part of it is actually just establishing a relationship with each of the athletes as best you can, so that they feel comfortable and confident in confiding within you. If maybe you're in an environment where you're working with some younger athletes, or maybe you haven't had a chance to build a relationship, I would really try to stress or lean on find a female within that support system to be a facilitator, or even a mediator essentially as well, to help break down those barriers. Hey, if you don't feel comfortable talking to me about this, feel free to talk to Jackie over here, who's the sports trainer or the assistant coach or whatever it might be. I think those lean on those people who are really helpful in that space. You can, in a sense, outsource some of the communication a little bit as well. So if you're tracking it through an app, that might alleviate, in the early stages anyway, an athlete having to come to you and say, hey, I'm bleeding today. They can track it in an app, and you get that sort of just data feedback, and that can sort of spark some conversations that don't have to necessarily go in and be super gory or whatever it might be. Just say, hey, how are you feeling today? I sort of saw what you put in your app. Thank you very much. So, but I think it's, a journey like most things. You'll just sort of organically go on. And like in all things, you should be super professional with addressing all types of, data, health and, physical performance issues. There's a lot of things that could be confidential that you need to just sort of be able to navigate in this world. For me, as advice for those coming through, I think at this point in time, absolutely, if you want to act on anecdotal evidence, I think that's a good thing to do. Like, as I said, I continue to provide that option, but try to make that as manipulatable and adaptable as possible. So you're not just doing a one-size-fits-all approach because you've seen one person react this way. As I said, if I based all of my training on Anne Hatchard, I'd just be flogging everybody every day because she's an absolute beast. Or conversely, this other athlete that I talked about, I'd be super fragile and everybody be swimming for 5 days out of every month. So you need to find a way to have a framework and decision make off of that. I think try to think about, what do we absolutely know? We absolutely know that there's probably a greater risk of you being iron deficient because you're just simply losing more blood than a male will lose once every month. We know that there are potentially, for those who, we talked about in Bridget Belton's episode how she's had some issues that directly relate to her uterus. Well, we know that can't happen in a male. So if there's somebody, so those are some very specific. If I'm then thinking, and starting to program because a woman's Q angle, which is the angle between the outer point of their hip and their knee, is a little bit greater, that's still a hypothesis. So maybe don't make such great decision making around those more nuanced things. It's like, what do you absolutely know? And probably the other thing as well, I did actually, when I was part of another organisation, I got to go and sit and watch a pelvic floor physiotherapist expert and talk about return to play protocols for those who are giving birth. So we absolutely know people who've given birth are going to potentially encounter, some bladder leakage and those sorts of things. So that's another absolute that we know. So that's what I would focus on for sure.
I think, look, time's getting away from us here, and this is such a broad and, as you said, ever evolving conversation and space. So I think we could talk on it for ages. But I think some of the key things to maybe really recap and take away there is our gratitude for those early experiences in female sport and the way that they maybe shaped you as a coach and shaped our family's experience with high performance. Maybe it led me into a false sense of security, to be honest, to say, sure, Sean, keep chasing this high performance thing because everyone's so lovely and welcoming, and I don't know if that was a good thing or not anyway. And then, how it is really just in its infancies, and to continue to advocate if you're in a position of working with female athletes. If you are coming through university, ask those questions, push for more research, be curious, help to develop those findings and understandings, because 50%, if not more, actually slightly more of the population and you're going to, as an S&C coach, probably come across a female athlete in your time, so it's important to be across some of that information, and then absolutely being across the menstrual cycle. But as I heard you say, not making any assumptions about that, being curious, being compassionate, and leaning on those in your support circle to really guide those conversations.
Yeah, we wouldn't be where we are today as a business. I wouldn't be here where I am as a practitioner without those female sport experiences. We've got lifelong connections and friends that we'll always be grateful for. And for anybody out there, make sure you support female sport. Get out and watch it. Go attend games. Watch it on TV. Sign up your kids to get down and get involved in all types of sports. Don't think that your daughter just has to play netball or gymnastics. So, I think it's fantastic. And thank you for supporting me on the journey. It's been a pleasure having another date afternoon with you.
So there we have it, an exploration into Sean's experience working in female high-performance sport. My two key takeaways from that were the really nurturing and welcoming environment that those female teams gave to both Sean and myself in the early days, juggling a family, business, and chasing a career in high-performance sport. And secondly, this is a space where really the research is still evolving. So speak to your athletes to find out what's going to help best to support them to create that optimal performance environment.